Hello, everyone. My name is Shazad Mirza. I'm the Director of Operations. Welcome to the DMARC Bootcamp. We have about 5 minutes until the start time. We are expecting a very large number of people for this webinar, so we expect to start at least 2 minutes after the actual start time. In the meantime, just as a reminder, there is a questions box that is available to you in the GoToWebinar control panel. If you do have any questions during the webinar, feel free to post those questions on there. We'll do our best to try to answer it during the webinar. If we can't, we'll probably try to get to it at the end, or we'll try our best to email you and contact you directly with any questions that you have. And in some cases, we may actually post them to our forum as well. So we have about 4 minutes to start, but like I said, it'll be starting after 2 minutes of the start time. So that's 12 p.m. Eastern is the start time. So we'll probably start at 12:02 p.m. Eastern. Thank you. Hello, everyone. We have about a minute until we start. Just as a reminder, we will most likely start at about 2 minutes after the start time, just to allow for everyone to get on and join the session, and so that they can take everything in. Just as a reminder, again, the questions box is available to you. If you have any questions, please post them during the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer them as we go along. Hello, everyone, and welcome to session 2 of the DMARC Bootcamp. My name is Shahzad Mirza. I'm the Director of Operations, and I obviously will be going through the remainder of these sessions. So just to start off, I want to just remind folks about what's coming up with the webinar. So obviously we're finishing up week 2 by Friday. We have weeks 3, 4, 5, and 6 coming up. If you have not registered for those webinars, please make sure you do so. Also, make sure you do select the correct time, right? There are 3 times. There's 7 a.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Eastern, and 11:59 p.m. Eastern. So you can choose any one of those. So when you go to the registration link, just from the drop down, just click on that time, and it should display all 3 times available for these webinars. So also, as a reminder, on Friday, September 13th, we did send out an email with additional information. The email does come from info@globalcyberalliance.org. So please make sure that you look out for that message. It's good to have the DMARC Bootcamp in the subject line. But in case you did not get that, here are the links that we provided in that last email. So we have the community forum, which is a forum that currently has just our DMARC-based project in there. So it allows you to go ahead and post, ask any questions that you may have about DMARC, SPF, DKIM, and the bootcamp itself. So please go ahead and register. It is free to register and for you to access. In the near future, we will be adding other projects to that forum as well. You can participate in those as you choose. It's completely up to you. It's open and free to use. Then we also created a bootcamp resource page. So this is where we're going to post all the webinars. We'll put up the slides as well, since we're getting a large number of people asking for slides. It's just easier just to post the link there to that slide up there and post the link to the webinar right up there as well. So both of those. So our plan is to update these during the week. The videos most likely won't be up until the end of the week, so the Friday of the week. So be on the lookout for that. We'll also send out email reminders as well when these pages have been updated, and also provide links to the upcoming webinars as well in those emails. So please watch out for that. So it's just taking care of all of that to put all the bootcamp stuff aside. So now let's go ahead and actually get started in our presentation and what you guys are really more interested in probably. So we're going to talk about SPF and DKIM in this session. So we are going to actually go pretty deep into it. We're going to get very technical with each one of these. So we're going to explain what they do, what the purpose of it is, what the policies look like. So what are the different components of those policies? So this way you have a better understanding of what you're dealing with and what you're handling. So it is going to get quite technical, and there'll be a lot of technical jargon being used as well. So let's go ahead and get started with the sender policy framework. So SPF, that's going to be the first one. So what is SPF? So SPF is going to be your policy that you create that's going to say anything or any systems or IPs or domains that are on this policy are allowed to send mail using my domain name. That's what the SPF is, the sender policy framework. So just like we talked about with DMARC, there's also 2 parts to SPF. There's a record that you're going to create as a sending organization, but then the receiving side is also going to need to have SPF verification enabled. So there's still 2 parts to this. You create the policy as a sending organization. The receiving side is going to get the information. It has to enable SPF verification on their end in order to check for SPF and look up the SPF policy. So what this is going to do is going to use the portion that's called like an envelope from section in the headers of all the messages that's being received to see who the sending domain is, and make sure that when it checks that sending domain, that these are the IP addresses or the domains or anything that's involved with that for this particular organization. So that's something that's in the background, the headers. So it's envelope from, but also can be known as return path as well. When you're creating an SPF record, it is going to be a TXT record. So you're creating a TXT record in your DNS. Now, the key thing is that you can only have 1 SPF record per domain. That does not include subdomains. So your subdomains do not automatically use your top level domains SPF policy. So if you have if you have subdomains and they have their own mail systems or own mail servers, you're going to have to create an SPF record for each one as well, each one of those. So that's very important to take into account. So it's only one SPF record per domain, per subdomain, top level domain, and so on and so forth. So how does the flow of SPF work? So first and foremost, obviously, you're going to be publishing the SPF record on your DNS server. The sending side, so the sender, the person who types up the message and hits send, again, you're not installing anything on their machines. There's nothing special, nothing being done on their end. So nothing new or is being installed. Again, this is going to be very transparent to all the users. The message gets sent to the sending email server or service. That's where all the headers are going to be added. But by default, this always happens. So it's always going to add the envelope from or the return path. It's going to add the IPs of where the servers are coming from and the sending IP and so on and so forth. That's already there. That's done by default. So you're not going in and installing some sort of special SPF tool in order to do that. So there's no special tool. Again, you're setting up on your email servers or on your email services. So all that data is already appended by default. You send out the message, and then the receiving end, like I said, has to have SPF verification enabled in order to check for SPF. Because what it's going to basically do is say, okay, these messages are coming. We check for SPF for all the messages that are incoming. So let's go back to see if the sending domain has an SPF policy or not. If SPF verification is not enabled, the message will just go through and just pass through and go through the regular filters that are already there. So now, once SPF verification is enabled, it's going back to the sending organizations to check for a policy. If the policy exists, it's going to take a check to say, okay, this is the IP or this is the domain that this email message we're receiving is coming from. Is it on your list? Is it on your authorized list? And if it is, great, we'll handle the message and let it go through. If it's not, then there's different levels of failure that are considered for SPF. Problem is, though, SPF only defines if the message fails or if it doesn't fail. It doesn't specifically say what to do with the message if it fails. It just says this message is considered a failure. You do what you need to do with it. So the recipient needs to make that decision, what needs to happen and what's going on. So that's a little shortfall for this, because now the receiving side shouldn't have to really make that decision, but in most cases they'll turn it on, and if anything doesn't pass your policy, they typically quarantine it. In some cases, they actually end up rejecting it. But the other problem you'll see is that you actually don't get reports at that end. So there's a question here is, how do you ensure that receiving email service has SPF turned on? You as a sending organization, you can't do that. You as a receiving side, what you can actually do is, if you go to your email security gateways or some spam filters and anti-phishing tools or a cloud security service provider, they have SPF verification option. You have to just go in there and turn it on at that point. So once you click, you put in that checkbox, you're going to decide what happens with the messages. If they fail SPF, where to place them, to put it in quarantine, let it go through and go to the user spam box. Those are decisions that you're going to have to make. So those are the things that are going on. So SPF verification, yes. So there's a question here: is SPF verification is done at the mail gateway, not the Exchange server? Yes, in most cases, that's where the option is going to be enabled. Exchange server, if that's all you have and you don't have a mail gateway, I believe there is an option in Exchange to turn it on, but typically it's going to be done at the mail gateway, and it should be done on the mail gateway, so that way it checks for everything behind that gateway, and that's where you should do it. You know, it's better for the servers at that point, your mail servers at that point. In terms of SPF working for Exchange Online customers, somebody's asking this. So you have to create the SPF policy. SPF verification by default is enabled if you're using Exchange Online, so Office 365. By default, SPF verification is enabled, but you still have to go in and create an SPF policy for your domain. That's still required. So what do these records look like? So again, these are typically going to be TXT records that you're creating in your DNS. So on your public DNS system, this is what you're going to be creating. So when you're creating this, and any type of record that you create, typically the record will have a name and then there'll be a value or like a text box that where you put the value into. So when it comes to SPF, the name of the record is null. Basically, you leave it blank. It's just your domain. So depending on what type of server you're using, you may have to put the domain name in. Typically, you don't. Or you could put an @ symbol, or you just leave it that field completely blank. And then if you put @ or @ basically means null. And if you leave it blank, what it does is automatically inherit the domain name. So it's automatically appended to it. The value is going to be the most critical part because this is where you're going to define what your policy is. This is where you're going to define what are the authorized systems and how to handle those systems, how to handle things that are considered a failure. So meaning like, is it what level of failure, I should say. So not how to handle the failures, but what level of failure to be considered for this. So we'll talk about this in the next slide here. So this is now we're going to be talking about a few tags on the next 2 slides. There's various types of tags that you're going to be the next 3 slides that you're going to be putting into your SPF. Are all of these required? No. A lot of it really depends on how your setup is and how your configuration is. The ones that you will need, I will make sure you know that these are required. So like the first one there, V equals SPF 1, that is required. So it must begin with V equals SPF 1. So it defines a version of SPF that's being used. So in this case, for the policy side, you're going to be using SPF 1. These next few tags, again, depends on what your organization is set up. So the first one's MX. That is looking at your MX records in DNS. So if you have, so typically MX records in DNS are going to be your actual mail servers. These are the ones that are actually used to send mail, and these are the servers that are allowed to receive mail based on for your domain. So majority of organizations are going to have MX records. There are very few that may not have MX records. So you need to check for that. If you have MX records, then include that and put in the MX. So that way you don't have to list out every single IP address or every server for your that's actually already authorized. So it saves you time in there. You can also use A colon, and then you put it in a domain. So this is other systems that you can add in that are for your domain. So this is these are the A tag is really what you need to use just for your domain servers. So you may not have things on MX, so you can always put things in like that. Include statement or include tag is really meant for external domains. So anything that you trust. So if you're using like Google G Suites, you're going to have an include statement. If you're using Exchange Online or Office 365, you're going to have an include statement. You know, so really third-party vendors are typically is where you're going to have the include statement in there, and then the domain that you're going to place afterwards. Then you have the option of actually using IP addresses over domains as well. So you can use IPv4, IPv6. Now, when it comes to IP addresses, it's recommended to use only IP addresses that you have control over. Right, so like one person suggested, it's better to use IP addresses before MX to save the DNS resolution. Yes, that's something you can do instead of putting MX, because it may have to go domain. It may have to look to do the domain resolution. You could put your IPs in there instead. So you could put IPv4 colon the IP address or a range. So you could put insider notation if you choose to, or IPv6 if you know your IPv6 ranges and whatnot. But if you start using third-party IP addresses, it could potentially lead to issues, because if they decide to change the IP addressing or change their ranges, they're not going to inform you of that. They're not going to tell you that they're making those changes, right? That's going to be up to you to make sure you actually follow that and make sure you make those changes whenever they make the changes, if they ever make those changes. So be careful when using IPv4, IPv6. It's recommended, again, use it for your own IPs that you have control over, rather than using third-party vendors. Some additional tags that you have are things like pointer, PTR. If you're familiar with DNS, there are things called pointer records, which is pretty much a reverse lookup of the name. So instead of, so it's looking up based on IP. So you can use the source's IP pointer record in a reverse map query, things like exist. So it looks up to see if there's any valid A record for the domain and allows all the tests to pass as long as the A record exists. The exist tag actually can also be use different regex commands as well, so it can get kind of complicated. So just be careful when you use the exist tag. Redirect, so you can redirect. So instead of having verification done by yours, you can actually redirect to somebody else's SPF. So that means instead of using we don't have anything, so just go to this person to check for all of our SPF records for our domain. So redirect is not often used, but it's something that you have the capability of doing, especially if you decide to use like a third-party vendor to handle all your DNS stuff, but yet you have your own DNS as well. EXP, this is going to say the DNS name of whose text records text may be returned with any failure messages. So just to give you a little bit more information. If you're going to use this, be very careful and make sure it's always at the end of the policy. Make sure it's always at the end of the policy. And then the last thing is the macro expressions. So this is where you can use things like regex and whatnot to do a little bit more fine tuning, prevent some of these, people are mentioning the DNS lookup issues. You can help use those macro expressions to kind of help do that. We're not going to get into it because it can get very complicated, and we could spend the entire hour just talking about macro expressions. So I'm going to leave that alone. We'll provide resources and references to you so you can see what those macro expressions are, and then you can take a look at those as well. Now, the other required tag and the most critical tag is the all tag. So the all tag. So there's different options when you set up the all tag. The dash all, tilde all, question mark all, and plus all. First and foremost, don't ever use a plus all, because that means that anything doesn't matter. You can have an SPF policy, put in a plus all, but that policy really doesn't apply, because it's just basically saying that any host can send mail for this domain. Doesn't matter if they're on the list or not. So it should never ever be used. The only time you may want to use that is if you're still building your SPF policy. So you just want to make sure that there's, mail is not being impacted because of SPF. So you can do that just to kind of do that once you feel more confident your SPF is correct, then you can move up. But really, you shouldn't start with a plus all. So the other options are, so you have a hyphen all, which means hard fail. That basically means if this IP and domain are not on this list, then it's prohibited. It has to be on our list. It has to be part of the SPF in order to be allowed and in order to be considered a good message. Everything else is done. So domain mail servers and those in the A include sections and the other ones as well. So I mean the redirectants and so on, those two, as long as they're defined. Those are all allowed as well. The tilde all is a soft fail. So that means basically if there's an email coming from a domain or an IP that's not on our policy, let the message go through, but make sure you mark it as non-compliant. So that's where you're marking it as non-compliant. So basically, these are, and third-party vendors tend to use the tilde all and recommend using the tilde all because they make changes and they make adjustments and they could add different things, or things could be wrong, or things could be set up incorrectly. So basically, at that point, they're meaning, well, in case something is missed or there's an error on our part, the message should actually be accepted, but just mark it as non-compliant. So now, but this is where the recipient has to make that decision again, what to do with that policy. Because if it's marked as non-compliant, they're most likely to say, you know what, let's just put it into quarantine and let it go. But that's up to the receiving side. Then there's a question mark all, so explicitly saying that nothing can be said about the validity of these messages. Again, it's not one that you should really be using because you want to make sure that your messages are considered valid and not being dropped or have any issues or any problems with that. So does a hard fail bounce the message? It depends on, again, what the receiving side has set up. So if they get a message from your domain or from some other domain that's not on your list and you have it as a hard fail, they're going to have to make a decision whether to send a bounce back or what they should need to do. So not everyone typically does that. So there's a question about someone with no tag, what is the default? So I'm assuming if you don't include the all tag, I believe the default is, I believe the policy at that point doesn't work. So it's as if you're putting the plus all. So here are some examples of SPF records and what they look like. So like the first one there would be something that if you were using Google G Suite, it would look similar to the first one that you see there. So V equals SPF1 MX include _ SPF.google.com -all. And again, you can use dash. I think Google actually recommends all. So, and that's where you're gonna have to make that decision. Do you want to use the -all or do you want to use the -all? The next one there is an example if you were using Exchange Online or Office 365. This is what your record would look like. The last one is as if you don't have your own MX, you could always just leave that out. So if you're relying solely on their servers, typically when you're actually using Exchange Online or Office 365, it would look more like the second one than the last one. Typically, they create MX records for you, so you should have the MX in there as well. But then an example of an IP, so you could put an IP colon and the address in there if there's a specific IP, or if you have a range, you can put in 161.11.10.0/32 or 24, whatever you decide for your subnets or supernets. So some things that are needed for SPF. So we talked about all these. Obviously, you need the policy, right? So you need access to your org's public DNS, whether you do it yourself as an admin, or if you have change control, make sure you know what you need them to put in, right? So that's why we explain those tags. So that way you can create the record for them and say, this is the record that I need to be implemented in DNS. And this is what needs to be created. Determine if you're using MX records. Again, majority of organizations actually have MX records, and you really should have MX records. But there are few out there that don't use MX, so you may not need to. So you won't need to use the MX tag at that point. IP addresses or domains of systems sending on the organization's behalf. So make sure you have that list, especially ones that are internal to your organization. Ones that are public, I should say, to your organization that are publicly sending out email. Third-party vendors, determine if they have SPF. Again, majority of them do actually support SPF, but what you need to know is what do they need you to add to your SPF policy. So what are you adding? Typically, it's going to be an include tag that you're going to be adding to your SPF. So they should provide you with that information. And the last thing you need to mostly make sure is you confirm SPF alignment. So just because you have SPF and the policy in place, there's a component that's kind of hidden, which is alignment. And that's making sure that all the domains actually match in that email. So that you're actually using the domain, so that way the domain is supposed to be coming from is the actual domain that's included in the header information. So that's where alignment comes into play. So we're going to go a little bit into the alignment aspect. So in terms of alignment, so this is an example of something that's good. So the from address is coming from Global Cyber Alliance. The return path is coming from Global Cyber Alliance. And then I just put the received SPF in there as a pass so people can see this is what Google typically does when they do a check on it. So they're going to check to make sure that the domain it's supposed to be this email is coming from is actually permitted. So fail would be when you're looking at the from, so it's coming from info@Global Cyber Alliance, but the return path says it's coming from a completely different server, so rsgsv.net. The received SPF, granted, it says it's passing, and then the received SPF is only for an SPF check. And the reason that it's actually passing in this case is because this domain, rsgsv.net, is actually coming from a legitimate IP address for that domain. So when an SPF check was being done, it was checking for the domain that it's the return path in there. That's where it's checking that part. But the alignment part right? In order to pass alignment, the from header must match the domain used to authenticate SPF. So the envelope mail from and return path and domain. So those are the things that have to match. So alignment is from the front and return path or mail from, but passing and failing is making sure that this domain is actually legitimate for this IP address. Right? So you have to remember that part. So SPF alignment is very important, especially when it comes to DMARC. Because when it comes to DMARC, DMARC is going to look at SPF and say, okay, is SPF passing or is it failing, and is everything being aligned? Right? Because in one example here on the left-hand side, everything is aligned in terms of DMARC. The raw record is passing, and the domain is actually globalcyberalliance.org. But when you look at the second one to the right, this is showing SPF DMARC fail unaligned, because the actual from address is supposed to be globalcyberalliance.org, but the SPF domain is saying this mcdlv.net. Why is SPF passing though? Because the IP address that's actually sending the message belongs to mcdlv.net. That's why that's passing. Because the SPF check is checking to see, again, it's checking to see the IP. Is the IP or domain that's sending it the correct IP that doesn't match up in their policy? It's not going to check the from header and the return path. That's where DMARC comes into play. So in order for this to work and fail unaligned, you have to make it aligned, because your domain needs to be there, not somebody else's domain. So some shortfalls to take into account. So one, the recipient server must decide how to handle the failed messages. So anything that's considered a fail, what to do? What are the next actions to take? Do we and a lot of recipients have to take that time and make the right decision in terms of setting up, because it applies, typically the SPF validation applies to all incoming messages, not just specific ones. And there are some systems will allow you to whitelist, but otherwise it typically happens, the SPF verification happens for all incoming messages, and they have to make whatever rule they set up applies to all those messages. There's really no way of checking to see if the messages were rejected or bounced, unless that receiving side does something to send something back. So that's something that you have to take into account. There's no default mechanism to make sure that the messages were rejected or bounced. You're not going to get a report back as a sending organization. So SPF by itself, it's great. Doesn't fully work as it's meant to do, because if you're using a hosting provider like Google G Suite or Office 365 or Exchange Online, you saw the records from before, right? They were using _spf.google.com, or they're using spf.protection.outlook.com. So that means that anyone else, because that record is going to look the same for everybody else that's using that same product. So what's to prevent somebody that's using that same tool, like Google G Suite or Office 365, from a different domain from using your domain, and for Gmail using your domain? By default with SPF alone, there's nothing really that's going to prevent that. There is a 10 domain lookup limit. I know a lot of people are posting questions about that. What's going on with the look? How do you bypass this? How do you get around that? Give me a second and I'll go into that. So the other thing to make sure is that it's not validating the header from, but use the envelope from to determine the sending domain, right? So that's for the IP and domains. That's what it's actually looking. It's the alignment that is being actually done with the from header, okay? It's the alignment portion that's looking for that. So, but SPF validation it's checking for IPs and matching the IPs with the domain and making sure it's on the list. And yes, the 10 domain lookup is a major issue. What people have done in terms of working around with it is to work with something they call SPF flattening, and that's where they're basically using IP addresses instead of domain names. But like I mentioned before, just be very careful with this, because if you're using third-party vendors, or unless you have a great partnership with them and they tell you and inform you, it could potentially cause issues, right? Because if that IP happens to be missing from your SPF, some messages could potentially get rejected depending on your DMARC policy level. So those are things you have to take into account and consider. There is a lot of vendors are now basically doing dynamic SPF. It's a capability that they're providing. I believe what they're doing is basically using like regex commands in their SPF to basically readjust and allow for certain things to get through and bypass actually putting in domains in there. So they can actually bypass these SPF 10 domain lookups. So that's another option that you have that's available to you. And then, yeah, and the domain lookup you have to look into as well is that even nested domains are actually considered. So if you're pointing to somebody else's SPF domain, if they don't use IP addresses, then you have to take into consideration that the fact that they may actually have domains in their SPF records as well. So most of them have reduced that to prevent this dynamic, this whole DNS lookup work issue, because they figure that if they supply the IP addresses, then they're safe and everyone else is safe. But some vendors just don't do that as well. So be careful with that. Yeah, and there's another person says you run into DNS text record length limits as well. Yes, that's very true, because there's 255 characters that you could typically put into a record for the value. So there's ways to bypass that as well. It's called DNS record breaking. So that way you can actually go by and actually go through and deal with some of these issues. So I'm going to take one more question about SPF because we need to really get moving to DKIM. So how would you troubleshoot SPF issues? For example, I've seen SPF records as non-aligned SPF pass. So in those situations, if it's it typically ends up being a third-party vendor, you have to really work with that third-party vendor and get them to fix the issue. When it comes to DMARC, we've seen a lot of third-party vendors where that's the issue, is non-aligned SPF pass. But if they have DKIM and DKIM is passing, then the messages will actually go through there, because it's either SPF has to be correct or DKIM has to be correct. They don't have to both be correct. So that's a way to get around that. And that's why DMARC is beneficial. How do you know if SPF is becoming a problem or things are aligned or not aligned? I'm going to go back to the DMARC reports. It's only the DMARC reports that are going to tell you about what's going on. So those two graphical examples that I gave you, those were actually pulled from a DMARC report, a human readable tool that I used, but that's where I was able to get that information and how to get that in there. You could do SPF nesting and point to other records, but you just have to be careful that those SPF values are not using domains as well, because the 10 domain lookup will actually include those, right? Because you're basically looking at that domain that you're pointing SPF to. Go to that domain. If that domain so that's one domain already right there. You go to that domain, look at their SPF value. If they have any in there, those are going to count as well, because you're still doing a DNS lookup for each one. And the reason they put in the 10 domain limit is to prevent things like DDoS, right? Because if you put too many domains in there, you can eventually go into a loop and you eventually cause DDoS type activity at that point. So the best thing to really do is try to limit the number of domains that you put in there. You should really reconsider that. Does your top level domain need to have 15 different marketing tools to be able to send messages out? Maybe you consolidate it into one. Other thing you need to take into consideration, if it's a subdomain that needs that particular tool, but not the top level domain, create the SPF record at that level. And then create a DMARC policy at that level, and the DKIM policies at the subdomain level. So that's one less domain you're putting into your top level SPF domain. So that's another thing that you can do, is just separate them out by subdomains. All right, so let's continue on, because there's still a lot more to cover in terms of the DKIM side. So our next thing we're focusing on is domain keys identified mail. So what DKIM is you're adding another level of authentication to all the messages that are using that domain or being sent out from a particular server that has DKIM capabilities on it. So it's another layer of authentication that DMARC is going to take advantage of. Now, the way DKIM works, so you can probably guess from the keys that this is going to involve PKI. So there's going to be private key and public keys. But before we get into that, when you're creating a DKIM key, when you're creating the DKIM records, they're going to either be a TXT record or a CNAME record. So a lot of it depends on what you're using to create those to implement those records. So TXT is typically ones that people, if they have their own systems, like their email security gateways or Exchange servers or their own Linux servers, you typically end up using a TXT record. The CNAME records typically will come in when you're using a third-party vendor, and the third-party vendor is the ones who are creating the keys and dealing with keys. So that should lead to that you can have more than one record per domain. So like, for example, on our end, Global Cyber Alliance, I believe we have about 4 or 5 DKIM records in place for different tools that we're using. So you can have more than one if you need to. So really quickly, there's a question, should you wait until SPF is set to hard fail before considering DKIM? That's really up to you. SPF is not going to impact DKIM, and DKIM is not going to impact SPF unless you actually have DMARC in place. So if you don't have DMARC in place, these two, SPF and DKIM, work absolutely completely separate from each other. They don't consider the other one in any way. So when it comes to DKIM keys, there's 2 keys that are being generated at this point. There's the private key and the public key, right? And how you generate the keys is really dependent on what type of systems are available to you. And I'm going to focus on two types of systems in this case. So we have DKIM with third-party mail providers. So if you're using like Office 365, Exchange Online, Google G Suite, or something like that, what will happen in those types of scenarios is that they will actually maintain the private keys themselves, but what they will do is generate a public key for you. So you can take that public key and then put it into your DNS as a TXT or CNAME record, depending on what they tell you and how you how to implement it. So they'll define that. They'll tell you what kind of record to create and what to actually paste in for the value. In some cases, they'll provide you for the full TXT record. Just make sure you take the appropriate components from that record, right? Because they'll give you the name of the record and they'll give you the value of the record. You may not need the full name. You'll need the full value, but you may not need the full name. You might just need part of that name to copy and paste into whatever DNS system that you're using. So that's when it comes to third party. So a majority of them actually do this. They support DKIM. You should actually implement it and use this for your own protection. Now, if you have your own systems, so your own internal systems, you're not using a third-party vendor. In those types of situations, it really depends, again, how your setup is going to be. If you have mail gateways, so security mail gateways, this is where you should have the keys generated there. The reason why you should have the keys generated there is because that way you don't have to install any special tools on each server, on each mail server. You can just have all the mail servers will be funneling outgoing messages through the gateway, and the gateway can sign all the messages for you. So just some examples are Cisco IronPort and Mimecast. There are other ones out there that actually have this capability as well. You just have to go take a look and see if that capability is built in. If it is, use the mail gateway to do this, because it saves you time from installing DKIM keys and DKIM signing tools on your particular mail servers. When it comes to Linux servers, assuming you're not using a mail gateway, so on a Linux servers, you can use something called OpenDKIM. It's an open source tool that actually does key creation and DKIM signing for your mail server. You have to integrate it into your system that you're using. So whether it be SendMail, Postfix, or whatnot, some of those tools will actually have something built into it as well. So, and I believe it leverages OpenDKIM. So you end up using that, but you just create the keys and implement the DKIM signing through the actual server. For MS Exchange, so for MX Exchange, what you're going to be doing in that case is that by default, it does not have DKIM and DKIM capabilities. There's no DKIM signing. There's no DKIM key generator or anything like that by default. What you would have to do is use an open source tool called DKIM Exchange. There are other tools out there that you can use as well, but DKIM Exchange is the one that's been the most recommended one to use. It's quite widely used. A lot of people have actually implemented it. I've seen it work and seen the implementation of it. And actually in weeks 3 and 4, I'm just going to quickly show you what it looks like, just so you have an idea of what the interface is and what are the different options you have in that interface. So it's available for free. It's on GitHub. Just go there and download it and install it on an Exchange server. Thing is, though, you'd have to install it on each Exchange server. So you can't install it on one unless that one Exchange server is acting as a gateway. But otherwise, if you have 4, you have to install it on each and every single server. Your other option is that you can always generate the keys on your own. So you can use OpenSSL to generate the keys. So you can generate a private key and the public key. Just when you use a tool like this, just make sure that the private key is placed where the DKIM signer can actually access it, so they know that it's there. You just point to it and make sure that folder is restricted access, right? You don't want just anyone going in there and actually accessing it. You want to be careful with that. So if you're in a hybrid exchange environment, so somebody is asking about this. So that's a good question. For the hybrid exchange environment, it depends on how your email is flowing. So for email, if your exchange servers are still sending mail to the Office 365 or your online exchange online, if all the mail is still flowing through there, you can use the DKIM key and the DKIM signer on the exchange online or Office 365. However, if your exchange servers are sending out mail separately and not flowing through Office 365, then yes, in those scenarios, you need to install a DKIM exchange, put in the DKIM signing and keys, generate the keys, and have those get signed that way, and then publish the DKIM keys for that. So that's something that you would do. So if outbound mail flows through Mimecast, so if you have Office 365 and it's going through Mimecast, have your Mimecast servers do the digital signatures. If you want to be safe, you can still do it. You can actually implement it on both. But the one that's going to get checked is the last one, with the receiving end is going to check the Mimecast one over the Office 365. Because I've seen cases like that. It actually signs it with both, but it's going to actually look at the most recent, the one that the closest one to the system. So it's going to check for Mimecast. But you have to just make sure the mail actually is flowing through Mimecast, because if there's any stragglers, that's where you may run into issues. So exchange load balancers, the key need to be installed and configured on the load balancer. Yes, because you need to make sure that both of the systems on the load balancer, you're going to be installing DKIM Exchange on each one of those. So that way the other one picks up wherever the other one left off. So make sure you do. Yeah, that's why typically when it exchange load balancers, really the recommendation is if you have a mail gateway, use the mail gateway for DKIM keys and DKIM signing. So that way you don't have to worry about which server is coming from. The load balance, you don't have to worry about the load balancer. The email server the server gateway, the email gateway is the one that will handle everything for you. So continue on. So what does a DKIM record look like? So I'm not going to focus on the CNAME ones, because the CNAME ones can change and they vary based on your provider. So the third-party provider, they're going to tell you exactly what those CNAMEs look like. So I'm not going to focus on that. In weeks 3 and 4, since we're going to do Office 365, I'm going to show you how it's utilized. So I'll show you the CNAME record in that case. But when it comes to DNS TXT records, typically when you're doing it on your own, and in some cases, third-party providers will use TXT records over CNAME records, you need to create that TXT record. And when it comes to these records, whether it be the CNAME record or it become the TXT record, they always start with something called the selector. So you can always see selector _ domain key, and then your domain name. And then the value can start with K equals RSA, so that's, I'll explain what that is, or it could just have the public key itself. So what are the parts of the DMARC record name? So the different parts, there's selector. Selector can be anything that you want. That's why I put it in those brackets, because it can be anything. There's no specific default that you need to have for a selector that you always should use this, and that's that. You can make it anything that you want. So a lot of these tools will ask you, what do you want the selector to be? Some cases, they may actually just put in default or just put in something in there for you. But you should in most cases have the ability to make that change. Like I think if you're using Google G Suites, by default, it uses Google, but it does give you the ability to change it. And I would say change it, so that way people don't know that it's just Google. Those are things to take into account. So it can be anything. It could be, you could put a default. You can call it mail. You can put the date in there, so you can use numbers. So you can put like 2019 09/18 for the date. So that could be the date that you created the key. It can be anything you want, any text value or numerical value that you want. Just make sure you know what it is, so that when you're creating the keys, you're gonna have to define it there as well. So you have to make sure that you know what it is, because you cannot change it afterwards. So if you decide to change it, you have to go back and change your private key, public key setup. After the selector, you put the period, and after that period, it's always going to be underscore domain key. So it's selector dot underscore domain key. So like Google dot underscore domain key, default dot underscore domain key, whatever for the selector, but it's always dot underscore domain key. That's required. And then afterwards, depending on, again, your DNS that you're using, you would supply your domain name, or you may not need it, because some DNS providers and some DNS systems automatically append the domain. So you may not need to add that in any way. For the values, so the text box area that you're going to put in the value for the tags, you can have k equals RSA. That typically defines the key algorithm that's being used. You're not restricted to RSA. There are other options as well that you can use, but typically I've seen RSA. You don't even necessarily have to have the k equals RSA there. The part that is important is the p equals, because that's where you now define the public key. So the string that you're provided from the key generators, that's the string that you're going to put in after the p equals. That's important. Now, when it comes to when you're actually generating the keys, you can have two different sizes, 1024 and 2048. 1024 is the most common size, and the reason that tends to be the most common size is because that majority of DNS providers can only support 1024, and because 1024 actually, it goes with that whole character limit for DNS records. So the 255 is the typical character limit. So 1024 creates a 255 character string. So that way you're still within that support capability. Whereas 1048, even though it is much more secure, most DNS providers don't support the 2048 because it goes longer than 255 characters. Can you do 2048? Yeah, you definitely can, and there are workarounds to it, which is basically called, I believe it's called DNS breaking. So basically, it's where you can put in one line, you put a slash at the end, and it means to continue the second line. But not all DNS service providers do that. Because we actually use 2048 for ourselves. I actually had to provide it to our provider and sound like, look, it's not letting me do it the way I want to do it. This is what I'm trying to put in, and they actually implemented it for me. Whereas when we switched providers, the new provider just did not support 2048. They said you have to change it. So we actually had to go back, reduce it to 1024, and then we were able to actually implement and use DKIM. So that's something to watch out for and something to take into account. So people are posting other tags. There are other tags that you can implement in there if you choose to. I'm not going to go through all of those, mainly because, again, different tools provide those tags, and they don't provide those tags. So those, to me, as far as I'm concerned, they're optional. You don't have to put them in there. I just wanted to really focus on the ones that you need to have in place. And we'll provide resources so you can look at what the other tags are. They're not really required. It's not going to hurt anything if you don't have them necessarily in place. So when it comes to DKIM, someone asked, is the DKIM signer for outbound relay? Yes, it should be out for outbound messages. It should not be for anything coming inbound. You shouldn't have DKIM signing for inbound messages. What you'll have is something called DKIM verification enabled, and that's going to check for the external or in all incoming messages to see if there's a DKIM signature applied to that particular message. So DKIM signing outbound messages, don't do it for inbound messages, because you will break a lot of things. People did that, and it caused a lot of issues. So there's also someone asked if you have your own iron ports, but want to enable something like Mailgun with DKIM. So I generate the public key on my iron port and post the value as a TXT record. Yes, that is correct. So you use your iron port to create the DKIM keys. The key will be there. Private key will be on the iron port. The public key is what you will publish in as a TXT record. For Mailgun, you have to go to Mailgun. You're going to have to go to that group and follow their instruction on how to actually create and set up DKIM on their end. Then they should have instructions labeled in their guides and how to actually implement DKIM. And then I'm not off the top of my head, I don't know if Mailgun uses TXT or CNAME, but it's going to use one of those two, but they'll provide you with that record information. You just create the appropriate record as needed. So items needed for DKIM. Obviously, still, again, you need access to your public DNS. So whether it be change control, whoever is doing it, you need to provide them with the record that needs to be generated. Make sure you know what your selector is, because that selector is important, because that's what's going to go into the DNS record. That's going to be the name of your record. Have a DKIM key generator and signing tool. So whether it's built into your systems or using an open source tool or whatever your third-party email provider is giving to you. Check to see if those third-party vendors support DKIM, because not everyone does support DKIM. They'll support SPF, but they don't support DKIM. So you can still get away with DMARC, because at least SPF, as long as SPF stays valid in terms of the passing and the alignment, you're fine without having DKIM. But the problem is, if SPF fails at any point, DKIM by default will be considered failed, because there's nothing to check. So just make sure SPF is set up correctly. And then once you find out, make sure you add the appropriate records, whether it be the TXT or CNAME records, and that you're publishing the public key. So you have nothing to do with the private key. You're just publishing the public key. And also, just like SPF, you have to make sure the DKIM alignment is in place as well, right? Because you have to make sure that in the message header where the DKIM signature is actually implemented, you need to make sure that the domain, which D equals, that is actually the domain for your organization, or that it's approved for your organization. So these are just seeing some other tags in the DKIM signature in terms of other things, and those I'll explain, like the relax I'll explain, because that's actually deals with DMARC. Those are some other tags that are optional as well. So alignment, again, goes back to the fact is DMARC checks for the alignment. So if it passes, or as long as the DKIM, the D equals, has your domain in there. If it has somebody else's domain, it's going to consider as fail unaligned. So as you can see here, because when the DKIM lookup is being done, the D equals, this is not globalcyberalliance.org. This is some other domain. DKIM is still passing because this mixedsignup.com is the one that's actually signing the message. So the DKIM passes because of this domain, but it's failed unaligned because, again, this domain is not correct. So it fails DMARC in this case. So those are things to look at. And again, these alignment things and alignment issues and the failures and whatnot in these reports, this is all going to be discussed in weeks 5 and 6. So the different subject matter experts will go into this and talk about this to some level. So some shortfalls for DKIM. So DKIM, again, it doesn't, so we talked about some of the tags, but there's nothing that says what to do if the signature is good or bad. There's nothing that says, okay, this is a hard fail or this is a soft fail or anything like that. It's just that a signature is added to this. Now you as the receiving end, figure out what needs to be done with anything that fails. So if the signature doesn't match the public key, you figure out what needs to get done at that point. And again, there is no reporting mechanism for DKIM. So there's nothing that's there. And it does not determine if the sender is allowed to send the outgoing mail or not, right? Because it doesn't have the SPF capabilities. It just has a DKIM signature assigned to it and says that, well, this is authenticated for this particular domain. So those are the things that are going on and the things that you have to worry about in this case. And then again, it's up to the recipient to make the decision on what's going on. So question is there a limit to the number of DKIM selectors that can be created for a domain? Technically, there isn't. So, I mean, if there's a mailing service that requires more than one DKIM key and they want it for each sender, then you create one. That's unusual. Typically, it's for the domain and not for the particular sender. But yes, but you can have multiple selectors if you choose to. Like Office 365 actually uses 2. They actually use 2 keys for you, and they have you create 2 CNAME records. So that can happen. But as long as the selector names are different, then it works fine. If the selector names are the same, then you're going to have issues. So we talked about both of these, and this is we're going back to DMARC, because DMARC is going to be the tool that uses both SPF and DKIM to check for authentication. So that's where we talked about some issues and some concerns, like resolving it. DMARC will help resolve most of these issues with SPF and DKIM, right? Because like if SPF you're using a hosting provider and using DKIM, and you have DKIM enabled, DMARC is going to say, well, check SPF, and look, does it have DKIM? Oh, hey, it has DKIM. Check that as well. To make sure that it's actually coming from the domain. So it's improving the capabilities of this. And then the whole same thing with reporting, right? So SPF and DKIM by default don't have any reporting mechanism in there unless the receiving side reports back to you. In most cases, they tend not to. Some do, not all of them do. But the DMARC reports, like I showed you, will show you that information. And that's the only way you're going to be able to see and check to see if those things are being set up correctly. Otherwise, the only way of doing it and checking for SPF and DKIM, especially with alignment, is to look at the header messages of everything that's coming in, right? Otherwise, implement DMARC at level none, look at the reports, and that's where you can set up everything is set up. Is SPF and DKIM set up correctly? Is everything aligning correctly? That's going to probably be your best route to go in this situation. And then DMARC is going to do the compliance portion right now. So now the receiving side doesn't have to determine what to do with the message. The DMARC policy says that, well, look, if SPF or DKIM were to fail, do this. This way they're making that decision. They're making the change. You're the one who's defining it as a sender what to do with the message, because the error is on your part, not on their part. So those are the things that you want to, so that's why the DMARC policy is important, because as long as the other side, the receiving side, has DMARC verification in, they're going to look at your policy and say, well, if SPF failed but DKIM passed, okay, well, it's a pass at that point. But if SPF and DKIM failed, well, what do I do with this message? What do I need to do? And that's where it's going to look at your policy. So if I set up DKIM record for a vendor like Salesforce, what prevents anyone at Salesforce from getting that signature? Because the public key, this is a good question, actually, because at that point now you're relying on making sure that Salesforce is protecting your private key, right? So that's it, because what will happen is, because each selector will be unique, and it's unique to the organization, so it should hopefully prevent and protect things like that. Another workaround you can do is for Salesforce, they allow you to actually relay messages through your own servers. And that's something that we've done here at GCA. We don't let Salesforce sign or do anything like that for us. We actually say relay your messages through the Google servers, and the Google servers are doing all the signatures and signing for us. So we're relying on Google at that point. But that's the same case with any third-party vendor. If they're maintaining the keys, the private key, you have to rely and trust them and have trust on them to actually give you the support that you need. Yes. So just to quickly wrap up, because we're at a minute left, I mean, I will stay longer to answer any questions. Upcoming webinars. So we have the technical details. So just like today, we went through the tags for SPF and DKIM. We're going to do the same thing for DMARC next week, or the next 2 weeks, weeks 3 and 4. We'll go through each of the tags and explain what each of the tags are. But then at the same time, I'm going to show you how to create an SPF record, DKIM records, and DMARC records in Windows DNS, on Bind, and in Cloud DNS. It's not part 1 or part 2. They're all the same exact webinar. I mean, the wording may not be the same, but it's going to be the same. The message is all the same on both of those. So you can either attend all of them if you choose to, or you can attend one. So if you want like the CPE credits, people are asking, like, we missed the first session week 1. How can I still get CPE credits? Well, here's 3 hours right here. If you attend Windows DNS, the Bind, and Cloud DNS, there's three CPE credits right there that you're going to get to get the completion. So remember, we're saying 6 live webinars for you to attend in order to get that certificate of completion. And then you can use that as proof for your CPE credits with whomever that you need to supply CPE credits in there. And then it's also, as a reminder, we have our community forum. Please post any questions that you have in there, that you posted in here. In case I don't get to it in a timely manner, you can post them on the forum, and I can definitely get to them on the forum. And the other benefit on the forum is that I'm not the only subject matter expert on there. There's multiple subject matter experts on there. There's people who are on this webinar who are probably subject matter experts as well. So they can answer a lot of the questions for this. And then we also have the bootcamp resource page. The webinar will be posted on there. Hopefully it'll be on there by Friday, at some point on Friday. Otherwise, look out for the email. So we're going to send out an email that will let people know that the webinar has been posted, the slides have been posted, and additional resources have been posted. And we'll also have links to the upcoming webinar. The only way you're going to get that email is if you're registered for the bootcamp. So if for some reason you're not, please email us and we'll get you there, because the MailChimp registration link has been taken down. So you're not going to be able to refer back to that.
So just to take some questions. So if you can stay on, please feel free to do so. I'll probably stay on for another 5-10 minutes. So 1:05 or 1:10 p.m. Eastern, we'll end the session. So somebody is asking about October. Is it October 1st or September 30th? It is, no, thank you. That is incorrect on the slide. It is actually September 30th. So Monday, September 30th is the other Windows DNS one. So it will be correct in the email and the notices and on the form, it will be correct there. But it is, yes, it is September 30th. Thank you for pointing that out. So is DMARC either or both and when it comes to SPF and DKIM checks? If you have both, it's going to be either or. So if SPF passes but DKIM fails, it's still considered allowed through. If SPF passes and DKIM fails, it's still going to allow it through, unless there's other filters or checks that prevent it. Like in some cases, like Google may want to have both to pass before it allows it to go through. Or at least SPF has to be valid before it allows it to go through. So those are things you have to check and take into account. If you can have both, please do implement both. It's strongly recommended that you do actually do both. So where can you locate the recording from the first session? You can go directly to the YouTube channel. You could also go to that bootcamp resource page. So dmarc.globalcyberalliance.org/dmarc-bootcamp. The video is there as well. If you go to the YouTube page, you have to go directly because we haven't published the sessions yet. We're not publishing the sessions publicly quite yet. That will be done once the bootcamp is completed. So the question here is an email sender. All of this is great, but can it all be enforced to any degree if recipient systems aren't configured to use them? Unfortunately, no. The recipient system has to have it enabled. They have to turn it on. There's no force check. If you're using like Google, if you're using a third-party provider, most of those email service providers actually have the DMARC, SPF, and DKIM verifications enabled by default. It's not even an option. So they don't allow you to uncheck it. So like I know with Google and Office 365, the verifications are enabled by default. I haven't found any of the check marks. It might be there somewhere deep down in there somewhere, but I didn't really go looking for it. But as far as I know, I have not seen it or anything alongside of that. So how often do you recommend changing keys for the DKIM? I would really go with your policy in your internal policy that when it comes to PKI. So if you have public key, private key policies in place, follow that. Just be careful whenever you change keys. Like in the DKIM, if you look up DKIM, people are talking about DKIM, they say 3, 6, 9, or 12 months. I mean, if you have a policy in place, I would say every 12 months. Because remember, when you do this, you have to recreate the keys, right? So you have to make sure your private key is created with it, and the public key is associated public key is created correctly, and then you got to publish it into DNS, right? The public key has to get published in DNS. So unless you use a different selector name, it could potentially cause issues, because especially with DNS replication. Because remember, when you do the DKIM, you create the new DKIM keys, your DKIM signer is now using that private key. It's not using the old one anymore. It's using the new one now. So just be careful with that. So make sure you do this and publish it at a time where email is not really being sent too often. So probably on the weekends is probably the best time to do those keys. But typically the recommendations I've seen there, people said anywhere from 3 to 12 months. I would probably say 12 months if you really need to do it. So we have 5 minutes left. I'm trying to go through. There's a lot of great questions here. So I'm going to do my best to answer what I can during this. Right. Yeah, that's what I was talking about, the 3, the 6, 9, and 12 months. That's from the RFC. That's what they basically have in there. Does Microsoft implement both SPF and DKIM for DMARC for Exchange Online? Not for DMARC. So they actually do put an SPF for you, and they actually do, if you allow them to, they'll put an SPF for you. They do not, they have a default DKIM key, but it's the DKIM key they generate is not for your domain. It's for a generic domain. It's what they use that on Microsoft.com. That's the domain they create the DKIM key for. So once you implement DMARC, there's the DKIM key is considered false at that point, and then the SPF could cause issues as well, because you just have to make sure your SPF is created correctly. So you have to go in and create and enable you have to actually enable DKIM for your domain in Exchange Online, and then you have to create the records. And I'll show you those kinds of things on, if time allows, I'll show you those on weeks 3 and 4, on where you go into your Exchange Online and where you have to go to enable the DKIM capability and then create the records. Is there a way to discover what domains might needed to be added to the SPF include? So best way to do that is to look at DMARC reports. So set your DMARC policy to none, look at the reports, and the DMARC reports will give you all legitimate servers and unauthorized servers. So even if if you're not aware of some of the servers, you can go through and say, hey, here's MailChimp. Oh, here, this one looks like it belongs to Constant Contact. So the reports are the best way to add it. And then when you look at those, and then you can say, okay, well, these are the ones that I need to add to SPF. Go to Constant Contact. What do I need to put in on my SPF policy for you guys, for Salesforce, for MailChimp, HubSpot, and all these other tools that are out there. If you're using both SPF and DKIM, the best thing to do is honestly to align DMARC with both. Have them both done, for sure. If you were really to use SPF, probably the way you would go, but you want alignment to be for both. That's to better protect yourself, especially if people have DKIM verification and or SPF verification enabled. It's best to have an alignment set up for both if you can. I mean, I know there's going to be situations where you can, like the examples I gave you, but a lot of third-party vendors are making sure and they have rectified a lot of these issues. So you shouldn't have an alignment issue too much at this point. So for dynamic SPF, people are asking about that. Off the top of my head, I know ValueMail and On DMARC do that. I do believe there are some other vendors. I just can't think of them right now. So at least those two I know for sure are doing it, and I'm pretty sure there's some other ones doing it as well. So there's a minute left. I'm not going to probably get to a lot of these questions. So again, if you do have questions, please email me or email the GCA-DMARC@globalcyberalliance.org. We'll get to those questions. Or what I would really recommend is post them to the forum, because again, there's a lot more people that are going to be on the forum. We have over 100 people registered on there. There's a lot of people down there that can probably get to your questions. I'll try my best to get those questions as quickly as I can. But if I can't, at least there's other people on there that can hopefully answer your questions if I can't get to it right away. So again, at this point, thank you everyone for joining. We'll post this session hopefully by Friday onto this resource, the Bootcamp resources page. The first webinar is already there. The second webinar we should have up. And then again, join the community forum to post any questions that you may have, so we can get a more broader sense and more subject matter experts as well involved in answering those questions. Thank you for joining us, and I'm looking forward to having everyone on the next session next week. Thank you.